years after the death of Genghis Khan, the drummers of the Jin kingdom in northern China were once again beating out an alarm. In 1231, 2 decades after the Mongols' first invasion, they had returned in force. This time, the defenders faced a Mongol expedition determined to conquer the Jin once and for all. Under Genghis Khan, the earlier Mongol campaigns in northern China had been savage raids bent on plunder and pillage. But on his deathbed, Genghis is said to have bequeathed to his sons a far greater objective.
I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave to you.
His successor, Ogodei, swore to obey his father's command. But first, Ogodei had to learn to govern the lands the Mongols had already conquered, and for this he turned to foreign advisors. The most influential was Yelu Chutsai, a young official captured from the Qin court who rose from prisoner to prime minister. He convinced Ogodei that if the Mongols would be masters of the world, then they would need a capital from which to rule it.
Though the empire may be conquered on horseback, it cannot be governed on horseback.
A permanent capital would be built right in the heart of the steppe, at the junction of trade routes used by nomads and merchants for thousands of years. Genghis had established a military base in the area, and by the 1230s it had grown into a sprawling tent city. As a nomadic stronghold, it was impressive, but as a political capital, it was totally inadequate. The ever-expanding court administration and all its records were housed in tents. After traveling for thousands of miles, ambassadors and their retinue were granted the hospitality of a Mongol tent. Even audiences with the most powerful man in Asia were conducted inside a tent. Ogodei's decision to build a capital was a revolutionary one for a nomad. It meant abandoning a way of life that had endured for centuries, a life without walls or fences. Nevertheless, the new capital was not much bigger than a large town. Behind 3 miles of defensive walls, there was a small inner compound, or palace city. It was called Karakorum. Little of it remains today, but even in its heyday, it was not another Rome. The empire was not there to serve Karakorum, it was the other way round. This was home to thousands of artisans, marched from all corners of the empire to work for the Mongol court. It's still possible to imagine what it must have looked like 800 years ago. This is a Buddhist monastery built in the 16th century on the site of Karakorum. The assembly halls were mostly wooden, designed and built by Chinese artisans. They were richly decorated with silks and carpets and golden fountains from which flowed wine and fermented mare's milk. The streets echoed to horsemen and caravans. The sounds mingled with calls to prayer from Buddhist monks and other clerics. Centuries later, the stones and timbers of Karakorum were rearranged by the Buddhists to build their temples and monasteries and walls. The city was extraordinary for the variety and number of places of worship. Taoist, Buddhist and Manichaean temples, mosques, even a small Nestorian church. In an age where people went to war to defend their faith, Karakorum's religious tolerance was unique. Long before it was finished, Karakorum had become, administratively, the most important city in Asia. A stream of envoys came to pay their respects at the seat of the great Khan. But while Ogodei was still building his capital, his armies were on the move in northern China. Unlike previous campaigns, this war was proving long and difficult. For 3 years, the advantage swung from one side to the other. Eventually, the Mongols gained the upper hand. Millions of Chinese had perished. Millions more fled south, and Chinese power was reduced to a tiny enclave around the city of Kaifeng. Everyone who could took refuge here for a final stand. This was the most formidable city the Mongols had ever encountered. Jin power would not be extinguished until it had fallen. Kaifeng itself was an important trading center and had a population, now swollen by refugees, of more than 1 million people. It had long been a center for artists, poets and scholars, for merchants and craftsmen. It had many fine buildings and held one of the richest treasure houses in all China. Conquering this great city was vital to the invaders. The city walls were, to the Mongols, both a physical and a psychological barrier. Their success at war depended on speed and mobility, not on drawn-out sieges. The Mongols had to learn to be patient. They also came up against a skilled enemy who knew how to use artillery and gunpowder. They suffered great casualties. So, when eventually the place did fall, the Mongols were swift in taking revenge for having been so inconvenienced. They executed all the male members of the Qin royal family, and there were a great many of them. Then they deported the women to Karakorum as slaves. Next, they rounded up the men and examined them. All the craftsmen, doctors and clerks were deported. The rest were held in the city. They didn't suspect it, but the Mongols planned to execute them all. Not just in Kaifeng, but throughout all of northern China. It was to be genocide on an unprecedented scale. The Mongols destroyed what they didn't understand, and they didn't understand cities or farmers. When Ye Lu Chutsai heard what was planned, he interceded. He pointed out to the Mongol commanders that mere revenge was a sterile policy. The wealth of a city or a country lay in its people and their skills. Destroying them was pointless. Some of the harder-riding Mongols were unconvinced. Farming to them seemed a useless occupation. It would be better, they said, to exterminate all the peasants and let the grass grow for their horses to graze. But Ogodei listened to Ye Lu Chutsai, especially when he learnt that the Mongols might expect 500,000 pieces of silver each year, almost as many sacks of grain, and 80,000 bolts of silk. The great Khan was persuaded to spare the Chinese. By 1235, with the conquest of the Jin complete, the empire now stretched from the Korean peninsula to the Caspian Sea, an area of more than 3 million square miles. A third of all Asia, and all governed from Karakorum, deep in the Mongolian steppe. A capital so remote from the rest of the world demanded a good supply system. The city only existed because the Khan had willed it. so everything had to be brought to it. "500 caravans arrived every day carrying food and raw materials for the army of artisans and builders. There were government records from the conquered lands, and of course tax revenues, a seemingly endless flow of them that poured in from every corner of Asia. This was Genghis Khan's dream, the world paying homage to the steppe. With the capital so remote from all its domains, a fast and reliable messenger service was essential to keep Ogodei in touch with his commanders throughout the far-flung empire. Called the Yam, it was made up of riders who traveled day and night to distant outposts on imperial business. The riders wore these large medallions, called pesas, which identified on whose business they were traveling. Most were made of wood or base metal, but some were of silver and gold, testifying to the